Ji-hoon was just a ghost on a fire escape until he heard the one thing that could get him killed: Project Nightfall. When the street artist overhears a cryptic police code through a cracked precinct window, he realizes the city's most powerful man is walking into a death trap. With sirens silent and the tactical clock ticking, Ji-hoon breaks the golden rule of the underworld. He gets involved. He has 5 minutes to convince Park Sang-dae, the cold-blooded boss of the Geon-pa syndicate, that the untouchable bunker is about to become a tomb. In a world where information is more expensive than gold and a snitch's life is worth less than a can of spray paint, Ji-hoon must navigate a lethal web of crooked cops, Mafia pride, and a countdown that ends in fire. The raid is happening, the board is being wiped clean, and Ji-hoon just became the most dangerous variable in Seoul. The Seoul skyline was a jagged crown of neon and glass, and from the 60th floor of the Moretti Kang Tower, Kang Ji-wook owned every shimmering inch of it. To the world outside these reinforced windows, he was the Iron Architect, a man whose heartbeat regulated the city's black market pulse. His office was a cathedral of cold marble and sharp edges, where billion-won deals were sealed with a nod and lives were ended with a whisper. Yet, as the clock struck midnight, the power he wielded felt like nothing more than a heavy shroud. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, his reflection superimposed over the sprawling metropolis, but his eyes weren't on the traffic patterns or the shipping docks. He was looking at the woman sitting in the armchair behind him. Thalassa sat perfectly still, a porcelain doll forgotten in a corner of a palace. Outside, a summer storm lashed against the building, the rain streaking down the glass in frantic, weeping lines. She was watching the water move, her gaze fixed on a single point in the dark air. For 3 years, that gaze had never wavered, never sharpened, and never found him. Ji-wook turned away from the city he had conquered and walked toward her, his heavy footsteps muffled by the silk rug. He knelt at her feet, the sharp crease of his designer trousers hitting the floor. He took her hand. It was cool, limp, and terrifyingly light. "Thalassa," he whispered, his voice a gravelly ghost of the one that commanded armies. She did not blink. Her eyes, the color of a winter sea, remained clouded by a fog he could not pierce. 3 years ago, a shard of lead and a moment of chaos had stolen the woman who used to laugh at his seriousness. Now she was a ghost inhabiting a living body. Ji-wook looked around the room. Every piece of furniture cost more than a common man earned in a lifetime. The art on the walls was looted from history, and the air was filtered to a perfect, sterile purity. He realized with a sudden, sickening clarity that this penthouse was not a home. It was a museum for a tragedy. He was the curator of her silence. He leaned his forehead against her knee, closing his eyes. The irony was a bitter weight in his chest. He could manipulate the national economy, he could crush rival syndicates under his heel, and he could command thousands to die for his name. Yet he could not perform the one miracle that mattered. He could not make her see him. He was the most powerful man in the country, but in this room, he was a beggar. He looked up at her profile, illuminated by the rhythmic flash of lightning. If she would only turn her head, if she would only let a single spark of recognition flare in those hollow eyes, he would set the very building they stood in on fire just to keep her warm. The rain intensified, a dull roar against the glass citadel. Ji-wook stood up, his jaw tightening as he reached a silent, jagged resolution. The doctors said she was a lost cause, a biological machine with a broken processor. His advisors told him to move her to a private facility and focus on the encroaching war with the Hwang syndicate. But as he watched a single drop of rain race down the window, mirroring a tear that Thalassa wasn't capable of shedding, he knew the truth. His empire was built on the premise of absolute control, yet he had never been more powerless. This billion-dollar view was a lie. If the world had to burn so she could find her way back to the shore of the living, he would be the one to strike the match. The Iron Architect was ready to tear down everything he had built. He didn't need a kingdom. He needed a smile. He stepped back into the shadows of the room, his mind already beginning to dismantle the throne he had spent a lifetime constructing, calculating the exact cost of a miracle. The news of the Incheon's surrender rippled through the city like a seismic tremor, cracking the foundation of the underworld's perceived order. In the days that followed, Kang Ji-wook did not scramble to repair the damage. Instead, he methodically began to tear the rest of the structure down. He sat in his glass office, but the phone lines that usually buzzed with requests for mediation or threats of retaliation went unanswered. One by one, he signed the divestment papers. He sold his majority shares in the steel mills to a shell company in Singapore and transferred the titles of his high-rise developments to a rival faction that had been gunning for his neck for a decade. He was liquidating his life's work with the cold, surgical precision of an accountant, but the currency he was trading in was blood and influence. His inner circle was the first to fracture. His captains stood in the doorway of his office, their faces masks of confusion that were rapidly curdling into resentment. They had bled to win these territories, and now their boss was handing them over like scraps of waste. Ji-wook ignored their protests, his eyes fixed on a small photograph of Thalassa on his desk, taken before the world went silent. He knew that every asset he signed away was a layer of armor stripped from his body. Without the steel mills, he lost his political leverage. Without the docks, he lost his supply lines, and without the towers, he lost the high ground. He was becoming a man of flesh and bone in a world that only respected titans of stone and fire. The confusion among his enemies did not last long. In the ruthless ecology of the Seoul underworld, weakness was a scent that traveled faster than a bullet. The initial shock turned into a ravenous hunger. Small-time street gangs began to harass his remaining men, testing the perimeter of a kingdom that no longer had a king. The police, who had once looked the other way for a hefty fee, suddenly found their courage now that the bribes had ceased. Ji-wook watched it all from his thinning fortress. He saw his security detail dwindle as men realized there was no future in serving a master who was intentionally destroying his own throne. He was not just losing money, he was losing the invisible shield of fear that had kept him safe for 20 years. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, casting long, skeletal shadows across his empty office, Ji-wook felt the first real chill of vulnerability. He walked through the halls of his tower, hearing the echoes of his own footsteps where there used to be a chorus of subordinates. The silence was prophetic. He had stripped himself of his titles, his wealth, and his protection, leaving him exposed to every blade he had ever dodged. But as he entered the penthouse and found Thalassa sitting by the window, the chaos of the outside world felt distant and inconsequential. He knelt beside her, noticing how the fading light caught the gold of her hair. He had traded the safety of an empire for the slim possibility of a cure, and as the sirens began to wail in the streets below, he knew the wolves were finally at the door. His rivals were no longer confused. They were closing in, emboldened by the realization that the Iron Architect had turned his back on the world. Ji-wook reached out and touched Thalassa's hand, his grip firm despite the storm gathering outside. He had dismantled his throne to build a bridge back to her, and even as his protection vanished and his enemies prepared to feast on his remains, he felt a strange, terrifying peace. He was no longer a king, but he was finally a man with a destination. The rain in Seoul fell like liquid lead, washing the copper tang of blood from the pavement of the Mapo back alleys. To the morning news anchors, Park Sang-dae was a charred statistic, a casualty of a tragic gas leak that had leveled a laundromat. But in the belly of the city, the truth was a shivering wire. Sang-dae sat in a windowless room miles from the ruins, his hands still stained with the soot of his own demise. He was a dead man, and in that ghosthood lay his greatest weapon. Without a throne to protect, he was free to become the monster his traitors feared, systematically erasing every name on the list the mole had compromised. He watched the shadows, waiting for the first sign of a flinch from his former generals. Ji-hoon stood on a high rooftop, a fresh can of black paint heavy in his hand. The city looked the same, but the colors had changed for him. He no longer saw walls, he saw vulnerabilities. He no longer heard sirens, he heard intent. He was no longer just a kid with a mural. He was the ghost who had walked through the fire and brought the devil out with him. Every time he tagged a corner, he wasn't just marking territory, he was leaving signals for a man who didn't exist. He had become the invisible nerve endings of a broken empire, the eyes and ears that Sang-dae used to navigate a city that thought it was at peace. The boss owed him a life debt, a terrifying currency that linked the artist to the underworld forever. As the sun struggled to pierce the smog, Ji-hoon realized the war was only beginning. The city was about to burn, and he was the one holding the match. In this city, stories are written in blood and covered in chrome. Ji-hoon started the night as a boy with a spray can, trying to leave a mark on a world that didn't see him. He ended it as the only person who could see the truth. Park Sang-dae is gone, a phantom lurking in the static of the city's surveillance feeds, but the debt between the artist and the monster remains. As the rain continues to wash over the Mapo district, one thing is certain. Some secrets are too loud to stay buried, and some ghosts never truly rest. The raid was just the beginning. The real shadows are only now starting to move. Thanks for watching. If you want to see how the ghost and the boss tear down the city to find the mole, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. The underground is always listening.